Okay, so let's talk about faith versus science. Now, if you're taking some concept on faith, what that means is that when somebody is trying to convince you or provide evidence to support the thing that you have faith in, the more convicted they seem, the more credible you perceive them to be. So, if you already think that essential oils are critical to helping people cope with pain or skin conditions or things like that, and you meet somebody who really seems to know a lot about essential oils and they're telling you about the efficacy of these oils that they happen to sell, the more convinced they are, the more convinced you'll be. The more invested they seem to be, the more invested you'll become. You'll take it on faith. You won't actually question the claims because they already fit your narrative. In science, it doesn't matter how passionate the scientist is or the so-called researcher or whatever. It doesn't matter how passionate they are about their topic. It doesn't affect credibility at all. In fact, if you're too passionate about it, we start to wonder if you've reified your hypothesis. Going back to chapter 2. We worry about, why are you so passionate over the top about this? Shouldn't you be a little bit more dispassionate if you're a scientist? That's for people who are taking something on faith to be that passionate about it. In faith, I'm using a lot of sort of religious words because, when we're taking something on faith, it is sort of like you've really bought into it. You're really you're almost at that level where you are believing at the level of, sort of a religious faith. But if somebody criticizes what you believe in, you react as though they've said something like heresy, that, how dare you say something like that? It's the thing I started off this chapter with, saying that the science is settled on global warming and that anybody who questions it is stupid, is the most popular way to look at it, or a crackpot or a conspiracy theorist. If you are questioning man-made global warming right now, you get thrown into the same category as somebody who says that the world's flat or that man never landed on the moon. In fact, in the article I provided for you to read about this, in weekly exercise 2, it's exactly what they did. Is they piled people who are questioning global warming into the same category as people who firmly believe that there was a conspiracy to kill JFK or firmly believe that man never landed on the moon, things like that. If you criticize something that people are taking on faith, you're a heretic. Science should welcome criticism. There's a quote in your textbook about, I can't remember who it was, but I think it was Broadbent that he's talking about, and he's saying how much Broadbent enjoyed testing his own theories. If somebody criticized his theories, he'd pile right on and say, let me help you test it. I want to find out if you're right. Excellent idea. Let's do that. That's what scientists should do. Scientists should welcome criticism. Scientists should welcome people who are going to try and test the hypotheses from another angle. This is how you know that the global warming debate is not really between scientists. It's between political groups. Because scientists don't have the kinds of conversations that we see on the news or that we read about in Time magazine or whatever. Scientists welcome criticism. Scientists welcome a retest, a replication, an extension that might improve the theory, the hypothesis. Scientists welcome that. If you're taking something on faith, contradictory evidence does not sway your opinion. You go, yeah, well, that's just a special case. That's an anomaly. That guy's biased. He was probably bought off by, some company, and, he's just a shill. When we are taking something on faith, we do not want to, and we refuse to hear evidence that's contrary to what we already believe. It's just how it is. I'm thinking of a ton of examples. If you go back to the autism being caused by vaccines, if, as the evidence started surfacing that vaccines don't cause autism, people who firmly believe that they really do said, well, those studies that are claiming that autism is not caused by vaccines are paid for by the pharmaceutical industry. They refused to hear the scientific evidence because it didn't fit their belief, their faith, the thing that they were taking on faith. In science, if enough contrary evidence starts to pile up, it does undermine the theory. Ultimately, you start to realize maybe this theory is not accounting for the evidence correctly. Maybe we need a better theory to account for the evidence. In science, we have to be open to that, to the idea that maybe what we know so far is not right. Remember, we talked about, the temporariness of, the provisional nature of science. It's always possible that something new is going to come up, and that we have to be open to that. So taking something on faith versus taking something on, on the basis of science. When I was just talking to a student who I'm going to be doing some research with, and we were talking about her preconceived expectations of what she thinks is going to happen. And she said, I know I'm not supposed to say stuff like that because that's biased. That's a really common misconception about what I'm talking about in this slide. Scientists can absolutely have their prediction of what they think is going to happen. You're supposed to. That's called a hypothesis. You're supposed to make your prediction and then see if the data supports it. What I told her, and I will repeat to you guys, is it is not called a bias to make a prediction. It's called a hypothesis. What is biased is if you collect data and then formulate a hypothesis after the fact to account for the data that you found. Or if you make a prediction, the data doesn't support the prediction, and then you alter the data to make it fit. Or if you just pretend like you never actually collected the data because it didn't fit your narrative, so why tell anyone about it? That's bias. It is not biased to have a prediction, whether it's based on pre-existing literature or it's based on your previous experience and your expectations based on just being a human in the world. Bias comes in the interpretation, not in the predictions. Okay, so as I just mentioned, scientific explanations are temporary. I'm going to give you just one little example, and this does not mean this is what I mean by temporary explanations. What this slide is showing you is an example of why we always have to assume explanations are temporary. Okay, so 200 years ago almost, phrenology came on the scene, and that was the first real attempt to make the assertion that parts of your brain drive certain behaviors, personality traits, things like that. So phrenology was our first attempt, and if you're not familiar with phrenology, it was a pseudoscience. It was not a real science, where the idea was that if you have a big area in a particular part of your brain, it would push out your skull and make a bump that we would be able to feel from the outside, and that we could generate a phrenological map of your personality, things like that. It's kind of like getting your palm read today, might be. But it was a start, right? Well, ultimately, observation started coming on the scene. And so here we have Phineas Gage, he worked for the railroads. And that rod that you see in that picture is what's called a tamping rod. And it's used to tamp down the, what's it called? Nitroglycerin powder. I can't think of the right word, but they would tamp it down and with the rod. Well, something went awry and it ignited, and the tamping rod shot out of the hole that they were tamping the powder down into, and it shot through Phineas Gage's face, following that trajectory that you see in that picture. After that accident, he lived, oddly enough. That's amazing, right? It was like 1830 or something, and he lived. And no, this must have been about 1880, sorry. And after he recovered, he had some personality changes. So that he was one of those first early case studies where we could make direct observations of somebody who had something happen to him and then his behavior changed afterwards. So researchers started to get some insight into different parts of your brain and what they probably do. Then the ban was lifted on dissecting human cadavers, and so researchers got the opportunity to start dissecting brains. And they started noticing things like in the picture that you see there, there was a stroke and the person had changes in his behavior following the stroke, after the person died, they dissected the brain and found that where it says Heschel's, that part of the brain was missing. The part that's square, that's in the middle, that was surgically done. But the stuff on the left, and by surgically I mean after death, but the part on the left that you can see that gap, that was caused by the stroke and the dying off of the brain cells. Okay, so dissections gave us further insight into, okay, while he was still alive, he had these deficits in his behavior. Now that we've cut open his head and we can see inside of his brain, we're seeing these parts are damaged, make an association. Okay, we're figuring it out. By the 1950s, brain surgery started to become more common. And so the skull cap is off, we have access to the brain. The person can be awake during brain surgery because the brain doesn't have any pain receptors. And so a guy named Wilder Penfield had a patient who was doing surgery for a tumor in her temporal lobe, and took the opportunity to use electric probes to stimulate brain cells in the temporal lobe, and the patient reported hearing bells and different songs and so on and so forth. Penfield came to the conclusion that memories are housed in the temporal lobe. Well, it turns out that was wrong. Your memories are not stored exclusively in your temporal lobe. Your memories for sounds are, but not all your memories, right? So through electrical stimulation studies, we got a little bit more insight. And then here we are sort of in the modern times using PET scans and MRIs and fMRIs to make sort of these same observations, but now in living people who aren't undergoing surgery and other kinds of things. So as we've moved through here in time, we've seen better and better explanations arising, better and better understanding of the role of the brain in human behavior, right? That's the idea, though. One of the things that makes our explanations temporary is that as technology improves, so will our ability to understand and explain things. So technology is one reason why scientific explanations are temporary. Okay, so let's go ahead and take a little break here, and we'll come back in the next section and we'll talk about reliability.